Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So as mentioned earlier, the talk today is about understanding and coping with grief. There's a few, my talk is divided into 3 major sections where I'll be speaking about what is grief, coping with grief, and helping others with grief. So let me get right into it. After that, we'll have some time for questions. So what is grief? It's a normal, appropriate response to major loss, a loss experience that destroys a major piece of what makes life normal for us. It can be a person, it can be a pet, it can be a home, it can be identity, it can be health. And so it's a loss of someone or something important. And I think for all of us during this pandemic, we have lost people. We have lost jobs. We have lost a means of earning an income. Different ones of us have had different extent of losses and different losses. And it can be, so today's talk is mostly focused on losing someone. Although a lot of what I'm saying can apply to the experience of losing other things that are important to us as well. Yeah, but I'll be focusing on losing someone. So it's an experience, not a feeling. Because it's made up of a lot of different feelings, and I'll be talking about that. So mourning is the process that occurs after loss. Yeah, so you mourn a loss. And it's a human experience. The only way not to grieve is to not love or care about someone or something. So you see from the little poster here that it's not a disorder. Right, there's nothing wrong with this response. And also one important thing is the experience of grief is unique to the person who is grieving. So it's different for every person. And I think this is a really important point to take note of, because you might be looking for it having a particular shape or form, but it's a very varied experience. It's a very diverse experience. Grief is different for every person. It depends on who it was that you lost. Losing someone who is close to you, like a parent, a spouse, is very different from losing a friend. Losing a child is very different from losing somebody who lived to a ripe old age, for example. The nature of the attachment to the person also changes the nature of grief. If you are very close to a parent, it's going to be very different from perhaps a parent that you had a difficult relationship with, right? So the grief is going to take on a different form depending on the nature of the attachment to the lost one. How the person died is also going to make a difference. For example, an expected death compared to an unexpected death is going to make the experience very different. And also a person dying from an accident is going to be very different from having someone pass away from an illness. The personality of the person who is grieving also has an impact. Some of us, Some of us express our feelings differently. Some of us face up to things. Some of us tend to avoid things that are uncomfortable. And so that might change the experience of grief. The social context also affects the experience of grief. For example, if you were, you're part of a community, you would experience grief differently. If that community is supportive, it's going to be different. If that community doesn't acknowledge your grief, that's going to be different. The historical context also makes a difference. For example, if you have lost many people, then this additional loss is going to make the experience that much more difficult. So there are other stresses as well. For example, if you lose a spouse, that in itself is going to be very difficult. But if the spouse was the only source of income for the household, for example, then there's going to be an additional stressor, right? Or if the spouse was somebody who was very supportive and helped out with your business or helped out in the home a lot, that's going to make it very different as well. So there's a sense in which each man is like other men, each man is like some other man, and each man is like no other man. So the grief experience is similar in many ways, and it is very unique in different ways. And this is an important point to bear in mind as we think about our own experience, as well as the experience of whoever that we are trying to walk alongside. I'm going to go right into what are the symptoms of grief. And I think these are the symptoms of grief that I'm going to be talking about here. This is not a comprehensive list. There may be other symptoms that you also experience. So these are the common symptoms. There are feelings associated with grief. Sadness, I think, is something we all expect, are very familiar with. There can also be anger. There can be guilt and self-reproach. Many times when we've lost someone, we feel bad because of perhaps the last conversation that we had. Perhaps we haven't been in touch, although we would have wanted to. And so there can be a lot of self-reproach and guilt surrounding there. It can give rise to anxiety about death in general, your own death. It can also give rise to anxiety about the things that could happen to our loved ones. Suddenly it becomes very real that we could lose our loved ones. You can feel lonely. Fatigue is perhaps a not so well known but very common reaction in grief. We can feel helpless. Shock is also very common. Obviously, we miss the person, so we feel yearning. Something which is less acknowledged can be emancipation and relief. And this can accompany the loss of someone who probably gave rise to difficulties and struggles in our lives. And so when they are gone, you might feel relief, but you might also feel guilt because you feel relief. Numbness is very common right after you experience the loss. And numbness is our psyche's way of protecting us from a lot of feelings. When your system is faced with an overwhelming amount of feelings, it protects you by having you experience numbness. There are a lot of physical sensations associated with grief as well. Hollowness in the stomach, tightness in the chest, tightness in the throat, oversensitivity to noise, a sense of depersonalization where that means like nothing feels real. You can have a shortness of breath. You can find weakness in muscles. There can be lack of energy, there can be dry mouth. These are among some of the physical sensations. There can be thoughts associated with grief as well. Disbelief is difficult. You will find it difficult to believe that someone is really gone. There is confusion, preoccupation in the form of obsessive thoughts, intrusive thoughts, rumination. This is just repetitive, very disturbing thoughts, because it feels like you can't get rid of them. You can feel, you can have a sense, not so much a feeling, a sense of your loved one or the person that you have lost being there with you. This is reported, borne out by research. It's not uncommon. And you can see things and you can hear things as well. And so these might give rise to a lot of concern. If you are grieving, or if you are accompanying somebody who's grieving. And this is to let you know that this is common. It's not that you're crazy or there's something seriously wrong. Grief can give rise to certain behaviors. You can have disturbed sleep, your appetite is affected. You can start being forgetful and absent-minded. Some people withdraw from their communities, from interactions, from social interactions. You can have dreams, dreams which are pleasant enough, dreams which are disturbing. You could avoid reminders of the lost one. You could be searching and calling out. This is referred to as pining sometimes. There can be a lot of sighing. You can be restless and hyperactive. Crying is obviously very common. We're all familiar with that. Or you might be visiting places or carrying objects that remind you of the lost one. You can treasure objects that belong to the deceased. You might be familiar with people who don't want to give away the old clothes, who don't want to in any way change the room where a loved one used to sleep, for example. They want to leave it as it is. So these are symptoms of grief. So coping with grief. And as Christians, we want to put God at the center. God has told us to not be afraid. He has told us many times in the Bible that He is with us. And this is in the face of suffering. He doesn't tell you that that you're not going to suffer, that you're not going to have a difficult time. Sometimes He tells you that He will rescue you from it. But there is a period between the time that it starts and the time that it ends, where you are truly suffering. And at this time, God gives us this really important promise that He is with us. So what I take away from this, and also what I find from the work that I do, is it's really important for us not to be alone during this time. To acknowledge that we are not alone, that God is with us, and also for us to reach out to other people, and if we are trying to help other people, to ensure that they don't feel alone in this experience. And so that's central to so much of the grief work. So if you're grieving, it's important to not turn away from God, not turn away from yourself. I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by that. Not turn away from others. And it's not about getting it right. So when I talk about turning to God, and we understand that to be turning to Him in prayer, sometimes we might not be able to pray. And so it's not about being able to say the right words to God, but it's really just about showing up, about being in his presence, about being there. And it's also the same if we are walking with people. We want to give them a little glimpse of God by being there, by showing up for them. So this is the tasks of mourning, that there is a process involved in mourning. There is a process involved in coping with. And this is a roadmap of sorts, but I want to be very clear that these stages are not linear, that it's possible to keep going back to a previous task. For example, so the 4 tasks are listed here. The first one is to accept the reality of loss. And this is so important. And the way we do funerals, for example, is very focused on this, accepting the reality of a loss. So when we have a funeral service, when we have a casket, when we have an open casket, and this is all about accepting the reality of the loss by sitting with it, by taking time to remember, by taking time to acknowledge that someone is really gone. And so this process is really important, and that's why we do funerals the way we do. And processing the pain of grief is also something that we do at a funeral. We talk about, we give eulogies, we talk about what was important in the life of that person. We talk about what he or she meant to us. We sing about it, we pray about it, and we acknowledge the difficulty of this process. And a funeral is like a community way of processing the pain of grief. But the processing of the pain of grief doesn't end after the funeral. In fact, it's after the funeral and after all of that activity has died down is when the processing of the pain happens. That's when everyone's gone home, everyone's left the funeral, and sometimes that is when the acuteness of the pain happens for the person, and that's when it's really important for the person to be accompanied, and for us also as part of their community to make sure that after the funeral, days after the funeral, months after the funeral, that they could still be processing the pain and to be helping them with this. So the next task is to adjust to a world without the deceased. And this is, you know, they played a part in our life. We did things together with them. They might have provided a secure home. They might have been the source of financial support. And so adjusting to a world without the deceased is another step that needs to happen as part of the mourning. And at the end of it, we want to find an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. So a new life in the sense that the deceased is no longer there, it's a different life. But for many of us, we are afraid to forget the person that we have lost. And so how do we remember them? And again, in our community, we have many ways of remembering. We have pictures of them that we keep in prominent places. We talk about them. We remember the role that they played in our lives. We do memorial services. In more informal settings, we talk about them. When we gather as a family, we might talk about, this is what dad used to say. This is what mom used to say, for example. And we talk about this, and every time we talk about this, we might feel sadness, we might shed tears, but we have moved on with our lives, right? We've gone back to functioning, we've gone back to our life as it was, in the sense that we go back to work, we find a new form, a new sources of support, but we have not forgotten. And so we don't hope to get over the loss. We just hope to adjust to it and make a different life. Yeah. So coping with grief. If you yourself are going through grief, it is important to be mindful of what you're experiencing and to acknowledge and express your feelings. So this is what I mean when I talked about processing the pain of your loss. It's important to face what you're feeling. So, I mean, it's the opposite of suppressing. What you're feeling is the opposite of denying. Sometimes there's a lot of pressure on us to be strong, to move on. People around us might be giving us messages that they are uncomfortable with our grief and we need to move on. And so we feel pressure to deny what we're feeling, but this isn't healthy. You need to have a place where you can express what you are going through, where you can acknowledge what you are going through, and you can do this in different ways. There are people in your life whom you can speak to, people that you trust. You can speak to them. You can write about it. Some people find joy in drawing. Some people find joy in singing. There's many different things that you can do, depending on what is your way, which way you are comfortable with in expressing your feelings. Sometimes you are a person who's comfortable with words. Sometimes you're a person who is not comfortable with words. So you can have very many different ways of doing this. Sometimes the feelings can become overwhelming, and at that time it's important to stay in the present. And one way that you can stay in the present, which is the opposite of staying in the past or staying in the future. Staying in the past is depressing, brings up feelings of depression. Staying in the future tends to be about anxiety. And so staying in the present, it can be something it can be something as simple as breathing or being aware of your your present, saying, I'm now in 2021. You know, I'm not, this is the present. I am in the present where this worst case scenario, which I'm anxious about, has not happened. You can say things to yourself. You can also breathe. Breathing is a really important way of staying in the present, taking deep breaths. And there are many different other different ways of staying in the present. And if you need to know a little bit more about this, feel free to ask about it in the questions. So important not to grieve alone. So definitely reach out. I think we are very fortunate to be in a church community which encourages to care about each other. And so do reach out and find someone. There's formal help, there's counseling, there's official help from the clergy, there's unofficial informal help from perhaps your GG members, your Bible study group, church members whom you have a relationship with. And of course, we reach out in prayer. And it's not about the quality of our prayers. He hears us because he's the God who hears. So I have reasonable expectations. All of those things that I have described, the process, that really isn't a shortcut. It may take longer for you, it may take a shorter time. Expect the intensity and frequency of symptoms to change with time. It tends to get a bit easier as time goes on. It tends to get less intense. During this time, it's important to take care of yourself because there will be a strong urge to not care, to not be motivated to eat and sleep and exercise. to do things that involve taking care of yourself. So resist that urge to skip meals and not sleep, not basically do whatever you normally do to take care of yourself, perhaps reaching out to people, joining social activities. So do get back to your normal routine as best you can. This is a time during which there's a lot of emotions, and especially right at the beginning, be slow to make big changes. You might feel a desire to make quick changes, but this is probably not the best time because your judgment may not be at its best at this time. And if there's a big desire to make big changes, perhaps check in with people, seek advice, so that you are not doing something in the present that's going to have very big impact in the future. Another part of grieving is what is referred to in the literature as anniversary reactions. And these are reactions around when the death date of someone comes around. If you are married to them, perhaps anniversaries, perhaps around their birthdays, you might have an unconscious reaction. You may suddenly start feeling a really low mood without understanding why. And you might realize, oh, it's so-and-so's birthday today. Or, oh, I just realized that it's my anniversary. So expect that the intensity of your grief might be a bit more pronounced around these reactions. You may be aware or you may not be aware, but it's very, very common. So check dates and all that when you feel a particularly strong reaction after you've lost a loved one. The anniversary reactions could even be the day that you found out. It could be the day of the funeral. So just be mindful that this might happen too. So seek professional help if needed, and I'll say a little bit more about when this might be the thing that needs to be done. So helping others with grief. Listening well is really important, and I'll say a little bit more about that in another slide. Have reasonable expectations in that, and which is that grief is different for everyone. Some people take longer and some people take a shorter time. So, and as I said earlier, the nature of the loss will affect how long someone takes, who they are, as I've said, who they lost. So it's very complex, and so there's no pat answer like, okay, 6 months, 2 years, 5 years. It doesn't work like that. So just be aware that some people might need to grieve for longer than others. Yeah, and there are causes for concern, which I'll talk about, but have reasonable expectations that they can't be rushed through the process. So definitely check in with the grieving person, after the funeral, after some time has passed, to find out how they're doing. They may be doing fine, or they may not be doing fine. Offer practical support. I'll say a little bit more about that. Support them in getting back to normalcy. So coming to church, perhaps if you always came to church with, or if they always came to church with their spouse or their parent, maybe coming back to church for the first time might be difficult. You could support them to come back to church by saying, let me pick you up, for example, or let me meet you at the entrance and enter the service. Or you could say, I'll go with you to the hospital. Or, do you want me to go with you to scatter the ashes, for example? Do you need me to drive you to work? Just ask. They might say, I'm going to be okay. Or they might say, yeah, I would really like that. So check in on anniversaries. And of course, if you need to be quite close to know this, when the anniversaries are, when the birthdays are, or they might mention it. And I, again, encourage them to seek professional help if needed. So I add a word of caution here. And this is linked to expectations. So it might be very normal for them to be talking about the lost one a long time after it has happened. That doesn't mean they need professional help. And so for you to offer professional help, it might be seen as shutting down the conversation. And that might not be helpful. So I would be careful about asking them to seek professional help, because what they were going through might be quite normal. And I've described what is normal. So just be careful about rushing to ask them to get professional help. So listening well, be mindful of the relationship. And by this, I mean that they might be willing to talk to you about certain things, and they might not. So if you don't have a close relationship, but want to help, being available is important. And knowing that perhaps, they might not be comfortable talking about certain things, but that might change over time as you make yourself available to them. So mindful about where you are in the relationship. And so in line with that, expect a certain amount of communication, a certain depth of communication, or not. Listen to understand and not to fix. And here, I think it's important to be aware of our own needs, to perhaps sit with the discomfort, or our own difficulties sitting with the discomfort. So sometimes we might give them pat answers to just kind of stop the conversation, because it's really painful to see somebody going through pain, and we want to rescue them, we want to stop. And so it's really important at this time to just do the difficult thing and listen, ask questions so that you understand, to not dismiss or minimize. So what is dismissing or minimizing? Anything that communicates to the person that what they went through is not a big deal. I think it's best if we err on the side of treating it like it's a big deal. And so there are many things that we say to people who are suffering because we don't know what to say. We go back to tried and trusted things, which tend to minimize what they're going through. You might have gone through losses yourself, and you might say things like, oh, you'll get over it. Or I lost my parent too, and I was over it in a short time. This will be over soon. Things like that, which indicate that you're not fully understanding what you're going through. So offer advice sparingly when solicited. Definitely listen more. Pray with them. That's always appreciated. Respect their wishes. You might say, can I drop by to see you? And you might say, no, I don't feel like visitors at this time. And that might concern you a lot, because maybe they've been saying this many times. But showing up against their wishes is probably not going to be a very good thing at this time. Very important, observe confidentiality. They might tell you a lot of things which are really confidential in nature, which are very private. And it's best to just keep those things to yourself, and not be talking about it to anybody else. and listening well. When in doubt, put silent. As I said earlier, I think being available, being present to them is really very important, and it is a very tangible sign of your caring. So don't feel like you need to say a lot. So I'm conscious of the time, so I'm gonna kind of rush through this. Ask what is needed, offer it if it's possible for you to help with that. Spend time, meals, exercise, other enjoyable activities. Check on them, stay in touch. Educate yourself about the grieving process. There's a lot of information on the internet that you find to help you with very specific situations. So something about professional help. So prolonged reduction in functioning and well-being is a sign that maybe they need a bit more help than what you're able to provide. As I said earlier, the intensity of feelings should reduce over time. And so if what they are going through seems like the same years down the road from the very beginning, or even several months down the road, it feels very fresh, still very raw, and it's interfering with their lives in some way, then perhaps professional help is called for. Impaired personal care, like they're sleeping too much, they're eating too much, drinking too much. So if you need to be in quite close quarters to be able to see this, and you might need to gently bring up whether you think help might be. They might want to see someone. And I just want to say here that as a counselor, a lot of people have come to therapy because their loved one just talked about it, encouraged them. And I'm not saying pushed or forced, but just because you are someone, if you are someone close, if you're a loved one, you have this privilege of speaking into somebody's life. So if you've been part of their support network, you've been close to them, you've been there for them, they will tend to take your advice when it comes to seeking out professional help. And also because you've been in close quarters, you've seen them, so they trust your judgment. So if relationship issues are resulting from the grief, from the loss, where they are perhaps angry all the time, giving rise to stressed relationships, or they've withdrawn completely from community, and so you feel that it's not going well. If they have work issues where they are not concentrating at work, the performance is reduced, and they are just not able to function the way they used to before. So there's also medical issues with no physiological explanation. Like they go to a doctor and the doctor says, I've done all the tests and there's nothing, I can't find anything the matter. Sometimes it could be psychological explanation to a physiological situation. Suicidal thoughts, obviously very concerning, definitely might require some professional intervention. So this applies to somebody whom you're close to, whom you're walking alongside, as well as if you yourself are going through grief. So bear these in mind and do reach out. Yeah, that's it.